not in gold or marble. The legacy Pope Francis chose to leave welcome to our channel, where every story opens a doorway to the unseen and the unforgettable. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Share it with us in the comments below and be part of our growing community. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, because tomorrow we have another special story waiting, one filled with hope, wonder, and quiet strength. Thank you for being here and for walking this journey with us. In the heart of the Vatican, beyond the reach of tourists and golden ceremonies, there was a place where time seemed to slow, a place where stone paths wound through ancient trees, and the air smelled of earth and fading roses. The Vatican Gardens had stood for centuries, their quiet beauty untouched by the noise of the outside world. And it was here that Pope Francis, knowing his time was drawing short, chose to take one final walk. The doctors had warned him. His strength was failing. Each step was slower than the last. But the Pope insisted. He didn't want to be carried, didn't want to be surrounded by attendants. He needed this walk, needed to feel the soil beneath his feet, needed to remember what it was like to move freely, unguarded, unseen. Dawn had barely broken when he slipped out, dressed not in grand robes but in a simple white garment, soft from years of wear. His figure, slightly stooped, moved steadily along the familiar paths. Olive trees lined the way, their silver leaves whispering in the morning breeze. The fountains, silent at this early hour, seemed to bow in respect. Francis walked slowly, stopping often, not because of exhaustion, but because he wanted to see everything, to memorize every crack in the stone, every blossom still clinging stubbornly to its branch. This was not the walk of a leader burdened with titles. It was the journey of a man returning home. He paused by an old fig tree, one he had visited many times over the years. Gnarled and weathered, it had survived countless seasons of storm and sun. He placed his hand on its rough bark and closed his eyes, feeling the deep hum of life running just beneath the surface. For a long moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the crisp air, allowing the world to fall away. In this garden there were no politics, no urgent decisions, no public expectations. Only life, messy, sacred, imperfect life, thriving quietly in the shadow of marble and gold. A soft smile touched his lips. This was the church he had always loved, not the walls, not the thrones, but the unseen roots, the hidden prayers, the simple acts of mercy that no camera would ever capture. The rising sun cast long, soft beams through the trees, turning the garden into a cathedral of light. Francis continued walking, his footsteps slow but sure, making his way toward a small, familiar bench tucked beneath a grove of olive trees. He did not walk as a pope that morning. He walked as Jorge, the boy from Buenos Aires who had once dreamed, not of power, but of service. And with each step he left behind not a trail of grandeur, but something far rarer, a legacy rooted in humility, stitched into the earth itself, hidden from history books, yet destined to endure in hearts that knew where to look. The bench was old, its wood faded and worn smooth by decades of sun and rain. Pope Francis lowered himself onto it with care, his joints aching slightly from the walk, but his spirit lighter than it had been in months. From here, he could see the full stretch of the gardens, the winding paths, the towering olive trees, the splashes of color from stubborn autumn blooms. He sat in silence, letting the peace of the place settle into his bones. No guards stood watch, no aides whispered schedules in his ear, no cameras lurked around corners. Here, for the first time in a long while, he was not the leader of a billion souls. He was just a man, sitting quietly under a canopy of trees older than memory. Francis leaned back against the bench, his eyes lifting toward the pale morning sky. He remembered the boy he had once been, running barefoot through the dusty streets of Buenos Aires, laughing, chasing stray dogs, listening to his grandmother sing hymns while stirring soup in a cracked pot. There had been no titles then, no weighty expectations, only faith, simple and fierce, rooted in the certainty that love was the only crown worth chasing. Somewhere along the way, the world had grown more complicated. Ceremonies replaced laughter. Diplomacy replaced song. Walls replaced open fields. And though he had always fought to hold on to the simplicity of his calling, he realized now how easily the grandeur of the church could drown out its original beating heart. The garden reminded him. He thought of the fishermen Jesus had chosen, the tax collector he called, the sinners he sat beside without judgment. They were not men of marble and gold. They were men of dust and doubt, and yet it was through them that the light had first spread, humble and unstoppable. Francis smiled, a small, private smile. The world above him, beyond the garden walls, would continue to measure success in monuments and applause, but here, under the fig and olive trees, he could finally remember what truly mattered. He reached into the pocket of his simple white robe and pulled out an old notebook, its corners frayed from years of use. It was nothing fancy, nothing adorned, just paper and ink. But inside it carried his truest prayers, the ones he had never spoken aloud, the ones written in nights of quiet longing. Turning to the last blank page, he hesitated for a moment, letting the moment breathe around him. Then, with trembling hands, he began to write. Not a sermon, not a decree. Just a few final words, meant not for history books, but for a single soul someday, who might sit on this same bench and need to remember what Francis himself had nearly forgotten, that greatness is not found in crowns but in calloused hands, not in marble halls, but in the soft, stubborn bloom of a garden kissed by the morning sun. The words flowed slowly, as if drawn from a well deep inside his soul. Pope Francis paused often, letting the silence between sentences say just as much as the ink on the page. This was not a message for the powerful. It was not crafted for cardinals, kings, or even history's grand retelling. It was a prayer disguised as a letter, a whisper from one servant to another, across whatever years might stand between them. Love without counting, he wrote, the pen trembling lightly in his aging hand. Serve without being seen. Leave no soul forgotten. He stopped, lowering the pen, letting the words settle into the page like seeds pressed into fertile earth. A soft breeze stirred the olive branches above him. The faint rustling reminded him of distant waves, of whispered hymns sung by the poor in the barrios, where he had first found his calling. For a long moment, he simply sat, notebook resting in his lap, eyes unfocused on the horizon. He thought of the faces he had known, the prisoner who wept during confession, the mother who begged for her child's life outside a crumbling hospital, the old man who offered him a cracked rosary with trembling hands. These were the treasures the world rarely saw. These were the stones upon which the true church was built, not the polished marble altars or the gilded ceilings. Service, he realized, was never meant to be a spectacle. It was meant to be invisible, tucked inside everyday moments, living quietly in the hands that washed feet, in the arms that cradled the dying, in the smiles shared across crowded refugee camps. Pope Francis looked down at the notebook again, his heart steady despite the frailty of his body. This would be his final sermon, though no congregation would hear it spoken aloud. No applause would follow it. No headlines would proclaim it, and yet he believed it would find its way because truth always does. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, a soul would stumble upon this bench, this hidden message, and understand. Not through grandeur, not through power, but through love. Worn into the wood, stitched into the soil, whispered through the leaves. The morning sun had climbed higher now, gilding the garden in soft gold. Birds darted between the trees, carrying songs too pure to be caught by any human language. Francis smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the years lift from his shoulders like a cloak he no longer needed. He closed the notebook gently, pressing his palm against its cover in a silent blessing. He did not pray for remembrance. He prayed only that whoever found these words would know they were never alone, that somewhere, sometime, someone had walked this path before them, quietly, faithfully and with love that left no one behind. With slow, deliberate movements, Pope Francis rose from the bench, the old notebook clutched gently in his hands. The weight of it was almost nothing, and yet it felt heavier than any crown he had ever worn. He glanced once more around the garden, the swaying olive trees, the crumbling stone paths, the light pooling at the base of the old fig tree nearby. It was there he decided to leave it. The fig tree had stood for generations, its roots winding deep into the earth, its branches bearing witness to countless silent prayers whispered under its shade. If any place could protect his final message, it was this one, a place untouched by ceremony, hidden from the world's prying eyes. Francis knelt carefully, the motion slow and painful, but steady. With his hands, weathered from years of blessing and serving, he cleared a small patch of soil at the base of the tree. He placed the notebook inside a cloth wrapping, tied it with simple twine, and laid it into the hollow. Not buried deep, just tucked safely, lovingly, into the embrace of the earth. There were no witnesses, no marble plaques, no golden markers, just a quiet exchange between a dying man and the living ground, a secret pact that would wait silently for as long as needed. Pope Francis brushed the soil, gently back over the bundle, patting it down as if tucking in a sleeping child. He whispered a blessing under his breath, not one he had learned in formal training, but one from long ago, from the simple faith of his grandmother's kitchen. Prayers for the forgotten, he murmured, for the wanderers, for those who serve without being seen. He sat back on the bench for a moment longer, breathing deeply, committing the sight of the tree, the feel of the air, the sounds of the garden to memory. He knew that whoever found the notebook someday might not even know his name. Maybe it would be a young seminarian, lost in doubts. Maybe it would be a tired groundskeeper seeking rest beneath the tree's shade. Maybe it would be no one for years, or centuries. It didn't matter. The message was not meant for applause. It was meant for one heart, one soul who would need the reminder that greatness is not in being remembered, but in remembering others. A soft wind stirred the branches, scattering a few golden leaves across the stone path. Francis closed his eyes and smiled, a real, full smile that reached all the way to the corners of his worn, tired face. The notebook was no longer his. It belonged now to the soil, to time, to the future. As he rose, leaning heavily on the bench for support, he felt lighter, as if he had left not just words behind, but a piece of his heart rooted into the living world, waiting quietly to bloom again when it was most needed. The morning sun had risen higher now, spilling golden light across the Vatican Gardens. The old fig tree stood silent, its branches swaying gently as if guarding the hidden message cradled in its roots. Pope Francis remained on the bench, his hands resting peacefully in his lap, his head tilted slightly upward as if listening to a sound only he could hear. Time passed slowly, unnoticed. The bustling world beyond the garden walls continued its endless rhythm, preparing ceremonies, signing decrees, announcing headlines. But here, in this quiet corner of creation, none of that mattered. A gardener making his early rounds was the first to see him. At first he thought the Pope was simply deep in prayer, as he often was. But as he drew closer, he noticed the stillness, the kind of stillness that belongs not to sleep, but to peace fulfilled. Pope Francis had passed from this life with no grandeur, no final audience, no dramatic farewell. He had slipped away as he had lived, humbly, quietly, with his heart anchored not to power, but to purpose. The news of his death would ripple through the Vatican like a sudden storm. Bells would toll, banners would be lowered to half-mast, crowds would gather, weeping and praying, their candles flickering in the Roman twilight. World leaders would send condolences. Documentaries would be made. Speeches would declare him a reformer, a visionary, a leader of compassion in a hardened age. But none of them would know the true measure of his final hours. None would speak of the battered notebook hidden beneath the fig tree. None would mention the soft, unmarked place where the greatest sermon of his life had been left, entrusted not to marble or memory, but to the soil itself. Those who truly understood, those who had worked beside him in kitchens and gardens, who had watched his silent blessings over janitors and cooks, knew the truth. Pope Francis's legacy was not etched into stone. It was whispered into the earth. It was carried forward by unseen hands, in acts of kindness so small the world would never record them. And in that way he had built something stronger than monuments, a living testament that faith, when stripped of spectacle, still has the power to move mountains. Years later, under the shade of that same fig tree, another wanderer might sit on that same bench, weary and searching, and if the earth was kind, if the hands of time were merciful, that soul might find the notebook, might open it, might read the simple words written by a man who had once carried the weight of the world, and chose, in the end, to lay it down in love. And in that quiet moment, long after titles and crowns had faded, the spirit of Francis would rise again, not in marble halls, but in the soft, stubborn beating of an ordinary heart that still believed. As you reflect on this story, we would love to hear your thoughts. What part of Pope Francis's final walk touched your heart the most? Have you ever experienced a moment of quiet clarity, where true meaning revealed itself away from the noise of the world? Please share your reflections in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever found beauty in the simple, hidden corners of life. Your voice matters here, and every comment adds to the growing community we are building, a place where silent acts of kindness and unseen moments of grace are honored. We read every message with gratitude, and your words may inspire someone else who needs to be reminded that they are not alone. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe and join us again tomorrow for another story, one filled with hope, humility, and the quiet miracles that often go unnoticed. Thank you for being part of this journey.